Right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our third session for the Korean War Teaching Initiative. Today, we are joined by Dr. Gregg Brazinsky of George Washington University, where he is a professor of history and international affairs, and also the director of the Asian Studies program. Gregg has his PhD from Cornell University, and he has an MA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So he spent significant time in Madison, although, as we were just discussing, it was a few years previous to this. So Gregg is a specialist in U.S. East Asian relations, in Korean history, and in East Asian history. He is the author of Nation Building in South Korea, which was published in 2007 and is read, I will say, by graduate students everywhere and probably by advanced undergraduates. I know it's a text that I read in graduate school. And more recently, he's the author of Winning the Third World in 2017. So Gregg, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. And also thank you to those of you who took time out of your very busy days to come and listen to this.
Yes, and I appreciate it too. I've been very, very impressed with the live attendance of these optional events. And I know that you have so much planning to do and so many unanswered questions, as the rest of us do as well, and working in education. And I thank you for taking the time to do this. So we will follow the format that we normally do. I will pose an opening question to Gregg, and Gregg and I have a list of questions that we've identified that you submitted a couple of weeks ago through the form. But at any time throughout this, please feel free to raise your hand, to wave, to say something in the chat, and to pose your own question. So it's you have the power to take the discussion in the areas that you want to go. Just for a warm-up question, Gregg, I wonder if you can just say very briefly about your path to studying East Asian history, and particular to studying Korea. How did you become interested in that?
Right. It's sort of an interesting story. When I started out graduate school, I had no intention of studying East Asia or Korea at all. I'd taken Russian as an undergraduate, and so I was thinking of doing something on U.S.-Russian relations. And I think at the time, it was, though, very critical that you did another region if you did U.S. foreign policy. This sort of one-sided work that looked at American documents and archives but didn't do multinational, multi-archival research wasn't really faring very well, and it was clear to a lot of people that this was outdated. So I knew I wanted to do the US and something, and I actually, at the time, it was 94, 95 when I started graduate school, which was the time of the first North Korean nuclear crisis, and I started to realize, South Korea is actually important, and nobody's really written a historical study of the U.S.-South Korean relationship. It's one of our most enduring alliances. It's one of our strongest alliances, and it's a country where U.S. influence is so vast. And so I said, well, somebody has to do this. And, I also, Wisconsin sort of may seem a weird place to meet a lot of Korean people, especially in the 90s. But I happened to have a lot of Korean friends at Wisconsin at the time, in part because I lived in a dormitory which had a lot of international students. And I sort of got to know the culture a little bit through them. What was the food like? What would it be like if I went to Korea? And I started to realize that this was much more interesting than Russia, at least to me. I started to feel a deeper interest in it. And so then I started, applying for grants and stuff to learn Korean, and I was successful, in part because not that many other people were interested in it back then. There were, but it was still it was still sort of eccentric to be working on Korea back in the mid 90s. I mean, there were a small number of people who had tenured positions in the field, but nothing like there is today. And things went well, and I ended up writing my dissertation on nation building in South Korea, which became my first book, and that's pretty much how I got into Korean studies.
Yeah, I'm glad you told that story, Greg, because I can imagine some of the teachers here, if you teach high school students, and maybe if you're ever approached, informally about students looking for different opportunities, there is still a lot of money and scholarship to study Korean language, especially. And I know as a graduate student, after I started studying Korean, I received FLAS funding. I received critical language scholarship from the Department of State. There's actually even support for high school students in some cases now to study Korean. So, and I know for me, growing up in a very small town in Wisconsin, I was kind of looking to see the wider world and didn't necessarily want to join the military. And this was kind of a way that I was able to do it. And I think for most scholars of Korea, at some point, you've taken advantage of a lot of federal funding to study Korea.
Absolutely. I think it was, I mean, and again, the advantage of doing something not that many other people are doing is that at the time, there wasn't that much, there was competition, but it wasn't as severe as, say, studying Great Britain.
Yes.
Where everything you apply for, your chance is 1%.
Right.
Whereas Korea, if you were very good, you had a decent chance of getting the funding that you needed to do your work.
Right. All right. Well, with that background, Greg and I have a list of questions that we would like to go through, but I'll just pause here. And any of you who are participating in the live stream, is there any questions that you have that you would like to pose to Greg right off the bat, or you could type them into the chat? I will just pause for 10 seconds or so and see if I see any movement. All right.
It's going to take me too long to. It's going to take me too long to type it.
Go ahead.
You had suggested last week that we ask the same question again about the transition in South Korea from the and I'm sure that's on your list, right? The transition from the dictatorship to the more democratic, more open economic events that happened in South Korea.
Thank you, Mickey. And that was a question on my list, but I'm very happy for you to take in and take ownership and make sure that we are gonna discuss this question. And yeah, Greg, that was they asked this question to Charles last week, who gave an excellent answer. But seeing as how you wrote the book on nation building in South Korea, I thought that this would be a great question for you as well. So can you talk a little bit about Korea's economic and political development, and how would you, I know you've written an entire book on it, so how would you characterize that in a way that the teachers can really get a sense of it that they can take back to their classroom?
Right, and first let me say, it's great that you had Charles Kim last week or in the previous session. I think his work is really outstanding. I agree with him on a lot of points, but I do think we have a little bit of a different emphasis. I think Charles Kim's emphasis tends to be a lot more on the Korean side, and how did a democracy movement develop in South Korea? What were their guiding ideals? Whereas I look at it more in the context of US-South Korean relations. What did the United States do in South Korea to encourage rapid economic development and democratization? And why was it more successful in South Korea than it was in a lot of other places? And so what I argue in the book is that you have this distinctive combination of American nation building on the one hand and Korean agency on the other hand. And what happened in South Korea, I argue, because of this combination, is you had the transition from an autocracy to what I call a developmental autocracy. And what is a developmental autocracy? It is an autocratic government that helps to create some of the preconditions for democracy. How? First of all, by developing the economy, right? That's the basic concept, but also by building institutions, allowing for the emergence of a middle class, expanding educational opportunities. And once you have that, it's easier to democratize. But I also argue that it's not only the it's not only because of these developmental autocracies, and in particular, the Park Chung-hee government, which I talk a lot about in my book, that played a very important role in economic development. There also is still a popular element of this. What I argue is that the United States, even while it tended to support a conservative autocracy from the top down, it still tried to nurture democracy from the bottom up by shifting educational curriculum, trying to help South Korea to develop a develop a professionalized media. And so, ironically, the U.S. actually helped to create some of the seeds of resistance to the autocratic government that it was supporting. It wasn't a system that worked perfectly, but I do think if you look at countries realistically that today have vibrant, flourishing democracies, and in the post-colonial world, there's not really very many of them, right? Most of them underwent this similar transition. South Korea, Taiwan, both had a very similar transition from starting out with a sort of straight out autocratic government. And then this government started to promote economic development. And then decades later, you got more full-blown democracy. Now, I don't think that's been emulated or imitated in most other parts of the world, where these kinds of prosperous, stable democracies are still not very common, and in fact, they seem to be becoming less common.
That's a great answer, Greg. And I know we've been talking in comparative terms a lot, so I'm glad you bring up Taiwan. I wonder if, and this may be a little unfair, but I wonder if, just thinking broadly, if you were to look at, say, South Korea and Vietnam, or South Korea and, let's say, China today, where China today you have tremendous economic development. The politics look drastically different than South Korea, however. And in Vietnam, you have a similar situation where you have massive American involvement, but you have a very different outcome. So I wonder if you have some thoughts that might help us understand some of the differences between those two case studies.
Right, and this is where I think the United States deserves some credit. And I realize I'm critical of American foreign policy. I'm critical of US support for authoritarian governments. Everybody should be. There have been a lot of disasters in American foreign policy, a lot of things that didn't work out right. But if you look at Asia, the countries that are the most democratic today, and which are South Korea, I think Japan, there are certain issues which I criticize often in terms of how democratic they can really be considered. And Taiwan, although I don't know if I should call them a country or not, I think with our current relationship with China, people are going to be a lot less offended when you start calling Taiwan a country. But whatever you call it, it has a vibrant democratic system. And these are the places where the US was the most influential. In communist China, American influence was pushed out. In Vietnam, it was pushed out. Now, another question, of course, is why was the United States able to have an influence in South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan that it couldn't get in China or other parts of Southeast Asia? And I do answer this to some degree in my book, where I say, one important difference is that when you look at South Korea, they were a victim of Japanese colonialism and not Western colonialism. And as a result of that, post-colonial nationalism, which in almost every other region of the world took on a very anti-Western tinge. Yeah. In South Korea, post-colonial nationalism didn't have to be anti-American. It didn't have to be anti-Western. Yeah. And so they had an enthusiasm to accept some aspects of what the United States was offering that I think in Vietnam, they were a little bit more ambivalent about. In other countries, in the Middle East, there was much more ambivalence about this. And I think that's also important. I don't think that's the only difference between Korea and Vietnam, and why we were able to suppress insurgencies in Korea but not in Vietnam. But I think it's an important, I think it's one of the explanations that you need to think about.
Yeah, that's a really great answer, Greg. And I have to admit, I've never really thought about it in those terms before, as post-colonial nationalism in Korea looking quite different than it does in almost every other place, and especially in Southeast Asia. That's a really, really interesting answer. And Greg, as I've told the teachers from the beginning, you are free to say whatever you want, because our center right now takes no money from either the Korean government or the Chinese government or the Japanese government. So we have no one that we're afraid of offending. So speak your mind.
Right. Well, it's just, I don't want to cause a controversy, but I don't think that will be too controversial.
No. Right. Thanks, Mickey, for making sure that we covered that. Is there any other questions is there another question from the audience? Feel free to take this discussion in whatever direction. As I said, Greg and I have some questions lined up, but we're more than happy to use this time to answer your questions. So I will just pause for a minute, and you can unmute yourself or wave your little hand.
I have another question, but I don't want to hog, so we can wait on this if somebody else has another question. But my question is in regards to the desegregation of the military and how that impacted in the Korean War, or if any of you have any comment as to its impact, or did it have an impact, or anything like that. But willing to pass that and hold that for later if we've got some time later.
Right. Well, that's an interesting question. And I mean, I would just say from my understanding, I don't know that the military was completely desegregated on the ground in Korea. In fact, I'm blanking on the name of the author of the book, but there's a book called Black Yanks in the Pacific that talks very specifically about the experiences of African Americans in Japan and Korea. And one of the things that the author of the book finds is that, there actually was still different kinds of treatment in terms of where African American soldiers could have residences and where, white soldiers could have residence. Despite this, though, there are a lot of scholars who assert, and I think is true, that the Korean War actually did have an important influence on the civil rights movement back in the United States, because in World War II in Korea, there were a significant number of Black troops who served. And because of that, there were greater and greater expectations of equality. And, I'm not an expert on, the civil rights movement as much as foreign affairs, but I think a lot of scholars have noted that there were linkages, and there are reasons that, the civil rights movement starts to pick up steam a little bit during the 1950s after the Korean War. So I think there's sort of a lot of dimensions to that question.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'm going to drop, Greg, we're keeping a resource list for the teachers. So every book that you mention, we will add it to this list so they can go back and check them out. And one book that I would like to put in the list at this time, at that topic, would be An American Dream, The Life of an African American Soldier in POW, who is Clarence Adams, who was a veteran of the Korean War, ended up captured and in a POW camp, and was one of the few in the POW camps, one of the few Americans who chose not to repatriate to the United States, but instead to go on to China and try to resettle in China. Adam's story is a really fascinating story. He doesn't end up staying in China. He stays for quite a while, I believe more than a decade, but he eventually ends up coming back after he realizes that China has its own sort of racial issues, and it is not the paradise that he was told it was. But I think it highlights the situation for African Americans in the Korean War, that even though the military is making its first steps towards desegregation, even though there is gains being made, it's also a very inhospitable place. And for people like Adams, when they think about going home, they think about going back home to communities in the Deep South, which are also very inhospitable to them, especially to African Americans who are going to want to claim greater rights, having fought for the country. So I think it's what you're saying is exactly right. It's a very mixed bag of gains on the one hand and continued barriers on the other. And if you're interested in that, Miggy, actually, there's another guest that I was trying to get for this conference. Unfortunately, I couldn't get him, Mitch Lerner, someone Gregg and I know well, who's currently writing and studying a lot about desegregation in the Korean War and would probably have some good insights on that. All right, thank you for that question. And seeing as how we're on a roll here, I will just pause again and see if anybody has any questions before we go to the list. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I just want to build up on the last question. And speaking about the civil rights movement and racial inequities and comparing the Korean War to the Vietnam War, I know that Soviet and Chinese propaganda exposed U.S. racial inequities during the Vietnam War, and I'm wondering if that came up during Korea, or was that really not a thing yet? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. From what we know about POW experiences, the Chinese often did. Of course, China and North Korea both captured a number of American POWs, and they were put in POW camps for extensive periods of time, and they were given, nonstop propaganda during this time. But, from what we know, race was definitely a theme of communist propaganda, even during the Korean War. And what's interesting is David had talked about Clarence Adams. I actually think Clarence Adams, who doesn't repatriate to the United States, he goes to communist China after the Korean War. And just to sort of explain, give a little bit of background on this issue, what happens is when they negotiate an armistice to the Korean War, they come up with this arrangement where every POW will be asked where they want to return to or be repatriated to. And they could choose to repatriate either to their home country or they could stay in the country where they had been captured, or they could repatriate to a neutral country. And so, most veterans, well, actually, on the US side, most of them repatriated back to the United States. There were a large number of Chinese POWs who actually choose to repatriate to Taiwan and not go back to communist China. And so the irony, though, with the Clarence Adams case is that he goes to China, and then during the Vietnam War, he is actually used to make propaganda broadcasts targeted at African-American soldiers. And, they would say things like, in the US, you're treated terribly and horribly. Why are you fighting to defend imperialism? And, there were some parallels between that kind of rhetoric and the rhetoric that you had among, some African-American groups who had become more critical of American foreign policy by the 1960s. And so that's actually something to, so I do think there's a connection. And I think it's an issue, but I think obviously the issue has become much more prominent by the time of Vietnam than it was during Korea.
Mm-hmm. And I should preface this by saying I'm not 100% certain that's the case, but I'm fairly certain that one of the impetus behind desegregation during the Korean War was the fact that they desperately needed soldiers. So it was because if you remember from our curricular guide, they also institute what's called the KATUSA program, the Korean augmentation to the U.S. Army. And so actually a lot of units get racially integrated, not with African Americans, but with Koreans. And it's really in an act of desperation that especially in the early days of the war, it's going so badly and they are so outnumbered that frankly, they have to have bodies to fill the holes in the line. And they don't have the luxury of saying, well, I'm sorry, but there's no opening for you right now. It was, put the people wherever you can. I just want to, when we talk about propaganda during the war, I'm throwing a link in the chat here to Soul City Sue, who is one of my favorite characters. And someday I want to write a book about her. It's just that there's hardly any documentation on her. But if you're familiar with Tokyo Rose during World War II, someone who did propaganda broadcasts towards the Japanese, Soul City Sue ends up playing a similar role in the Korean War, talking North Korean and Chinese communist propaganda. But she's actually a woman from the Midwest, and I believe she grew up in Arkansas and ended up actually in Korea as a missionary, married to a Korean man who was unable to evacuate when the war happened, and ended up getting detained by the communist forces and ends up becoming a propaganda mouthpiece for the communist forces. But one of the things that she emphasized, just as Clarence Adams would in Vietnam, was the discrepancies in the United States over race relations and hoping to encourage African-American soldiers to defect or go AWOL or just refuse to participate in the fighting. That's an excellent question. And I got an email from one of the fellow teachers, Athen Biss, who unfortunately could not join us today. But Athen Biss actually wrote a dissertation on African-American activism during the Cold War, especially with the Soviet bloc. And I wish he was here because I think he would probably have some other resources to make us aware of another perspective. These are great. I will pause again and see if we can, we're batting 1,000 so far, questions from the audience, which is exciting. So I'll take a little pause and see if any of the rest of you have any questions you would like us to address. All right. So Greg, let's go to one of the questions off the list, and one of the questions that the teachers submitted about 3 weeks ago now. And I wonder if you can speak in just broad strokes on what military strategies were used by the U.S. and Korea to fight in the Korean War, and what strategies were used by the Chinese, and what did this say about the conduct of the war and the societies that are fighting them?
Right, and in terms of military strategies, there were a few sort of I guess the larger issue was when the U.S. first decides to send troops as part of the UN command. I mean, at that time, their basic goal is to just defend what's left of South Korea. But then after the Incheon landing is successful, there is a shift in military strategy, which was important, and that was the change to rollback. And so after the Incheon landing, American and South Korean forces actually occupy North Korea. And this was a very important moment in the war because there were a lot of atrocities committed by American and South Korean troops during this occupation. And so, when you start looking today, what are the roots of North Korea's mistrust of the United States and the West? Why do they want to be invulnerable to American attack? It's because of the events of the fall and winter of 1950. They still remember them. Now, after China enters the war, American strategy shifts again because American forces are pushed very quickly back behind the 38th parallel. Seoul falls again. And then American strategy shifts because they realize that rollback is too risky, especially with Chinese communist forces in the war. And so what they do instead is they decide to sort of stalemate the war at the 38th parallel or to just recapture South Korea. But there's debate about this decision, of course, between Truman and MacArthur, right? MacArthur actually wants to unleash Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party, which is in exile in Taiwan at the time. And carry out sort of a full-scale assault on the Chinese mainland. Truman doesn't want to do that. And so this is where, the US side decides basically to dig in at the 38th parallel and just preserve South Korea. Chinese objectives also shift. For a time, when Chinese forces first enter the war in the winter of 1950, and again, it's sort of the exact date is sometimes difficult to pin down. We know the exact date when Mao decides, but there's sort of some vagueness about when they really start entering the war in full numbers, or there's some different accounts dated to different times. But what's clear is that by the winter of 1950-1951, Chinese troops are very successful, and they liberate North Korea and push American forces back. And at this time, China also gets this idea of reunifying the Korean Peninsula. And this is also something that Kim Il-sung had been pushing very hard for. And Mao Zedong wanted it too, because, what could bolster his reputation in the international communist movement more than being seen as a person who dealt the American imperialists a really powerful blow and defeated them, and as being the person who liberated all of Korea from US influence. But what happens is in the spring of 1951, China launches something known as the Spring Offensive, which is not successful. And Chinese forces are actually pushed back be above the 38th parallel. And after this, there are some strategic disagreements between Kim Il-sung and Mao Zedong. Kim wants to reunify the peninsula still. Mao Zedong is more cautious after this because he realizes that, they caught the US off guard, but if you actually reunified the peninsula, it would be really costly. And so these were, this was sort of how the grand strategies shifted over time during the war. There's also a lot of other adjustments that need to be made. I mean, I think one aspect of the US strategy during the war is that it had air superiority for the entire war, in part because the Soviets never send the air support that they promised. But this really lets the United States completely devastate North Korea with its air power. So that was also, a part of American strategy, and something that Chinese and North Korean forces always needed to be adapting to. How do you deal with, air superiority?
Yeah, those are great points. And I think this is perhaps one of the things that makes the Korean War a little bit harder to grasp than some other conflicts, because the objectives in it essentially are changing quite a bit. Initially the United States goes to war just to defend South Korea. Then they decide to expand. Then in the end, they end up settling for just defending South Korea. And you have shifting motivations and strategies on the other side as well. And you mentioned American air power, which is constant. And I feel like another aspect, another interesting strategy is, at least on Mao's part, the willingness to actually sacrifice a lot of people in the Korean War, which the Americans never wanted to do. I think they understood that many Americans were not entirely sure why they were fighting for Korea, and they certainly were not eager to sacrifice a lot of blood doing so. Where, from what I understand from the reading of Mao, he actually viewed the Korean War in one sense as a possibility to eliminate some undesirable elements of his societies, elements that he thought would be reactionary to his revolution, and to the ongoing communist revolution. So if you can conscript some of these people and send them off to Korea to die gloriously in a war that furthers the Chinese nation, would you agree, Greg, that he didn't necessarily see these, what we would think of as catastrophic losses from the American standpoint, as necessarily too terrible for China?
Right, and I would say a couple of things. First, I think that's true. On the Chinese communist side, they said, well, we have superiority in numbers. They have superiority in technology. And I think one of the beliefs at the heart of Maoism is that human willpower could overcome technological advantages, right? So, so I think that's true. The military strategies that Mao chose, in part because he just didn't have the sort of he didn't have weapons that were as capable as American weapons in creating large numbers of casualties. It's also just some things are so basic, and China is still a poor country at the time. So winters in Korea are brutally cold, and the Chinese side, they would take volunteers from the southern provinces, and they wouldn't be fully equipped. So a lot of them, it wasn't always the case that they were dying from American bombs and firepower. It's also, dying of frostbite and cold weather and disease, right? So that's also, one dimension of it. The point about undesirables, this is sort of a complex question. I think if you look at the volunteers, where did they come from? A large number of them were loyal. They were people who had been with Mao and the Chinese Red Army since the Civil War. But what had happened in 1948, 1949, as the as the Civil War in China progressed, was that Kuomintang, or nationalist units, had surrendered. And then they had been incorporated into the PLA. And so when they are incorporated, they surrender because of a variety of motivations. Some of them, once they surrender, they actually become quite enamored of the Chinese Communist Party and their methods of organization and education. And so there were some of them that became loyal, but some of them that were more pragmatic. And I think this is reflected by the fact that, during the war, of course, a lot of volunteers who are captured end up choosing not to repatriate to China. Now, some of that is because of their initial beliefs, and some of that is because of 3 years of American propaganda had changed their mind. But I think the fact is that there were some volunteers who they were not eager. But I think it's a complex question, and I mean, they were not eager to fight, and they were not completely ideologically indoctrinated. But I'm also impressed by how many volunteers were quite indoctrinated. Yeah. If you read their memoirs and read some of the other materials about them. So I think the picture there is quite a nuanced and complex one.
Yeah, and I guess we should point out too that the United States has its own draft for the Korean War as well. So there was not necessarily an overabundance of volunteers in the United States either, and that was a very risky move on Truman's part. It was absolutely essential if the United States was going to be successful. I just wanted to throw out another resource when, Greg, you're talking about the North Korean experience of being occupied by the United States and ROC forces in the fall and winter of 1950. And I know when I teach on Korea, one of the works that I like to assign is Han Sorya's The Jackals, which is the quintessential anti-American novella written by a famous North Korean literary figure that's actually written during this period. Interestingly enough, the story is a horrific story of atrocities committed by American missionaries and medical doctors. It's actually not set in the war, but it's written during the war. And it's written when these things are going on around them. And I like to assign this to students, both to show them just how deep-rooted anti-American sentiment is in North Korea and how long it's been going on. But I also like to show it I also like to have them read it and show them that this is a novella that's still widely read today. And the term jackals to refer to a foreign leader as a jackal, or a foreign soldier as a jackal, is still something that happens quite frequently in North Korean propaganda, and it harkens back to this period of really just terrible violence and devastation that's going on at this point in the Korean War. So I'll make sure that that gets into the into our reference list. And I actually have a PDF of it that's been translated into English, and I'd be happy to share it with anyone who's interested in it. It really is a terrifying read, but it's actually, I think, very enlightening as well to get a sense of North Korean thought on this issue. Do we have another question from our audience on this topic, or on your own topic? I will pause just for a second.
I just popped one into the chat about the peace process, or could you talk a little bit more about how that went about? I know it took a really long time, and right, there was some debate about the shape of the table and all that good stuff.
Yes, thank you. So Mickey writes, could you discuss the process of the cessation of hostilities, negotiations, how that impacts relations and negotiations today? How do we get military readiness exercises, maintaining the DMZ, etc.? Yeah, can you enlighten us on that a bit, Greg?
Right, and I think I think the negotiations are actually a pretty protracted process over the course of the Korean War. And some of the reason for this, I think they actually start negotiations by 1951, or there's talk that they should try to start negotiations, but it lasts until July of 1953. And so obviously there's a lot of issues. There's the geographic issues, which need to be debated, because this is, one area where the North Koreans were really tough negotiators. And so they would, fight for every parcel of land and how it should be delimited, right? And it's also because the front lines are shifting back and forth, not a lot, but a little bit in this period between 51 and 53, with certain areas, being captured and recaptured. So, there's actually some very bloody battles that take place over really small amounts of territory. So first you have the territorial issue. Then you have the POW issue, which I've already talked about. But why did that complicate the armistice agreement so much? Because it was really, I think one aspect of this was that China and North Korea were both sort of worried that they would be embarrassed if a large number of their POWs chose not to repatriate. And so there were really, really long negotiations. And at the time, of course, the US maintains pretty large POW camps in South Korea. And there's actually a good literature now on these POW camps and what was done and how people in the camps were indoctrinated. I think this, what will happen to these POWs became a really complicated question, because some of them didn't want to repatriate, and it made it really challenging. So that's the POW issue was another issue that coming to a final armistice agreement took so long. And there's also changes in leadership that occur. In 1952 in the United States, of course, you have the election of President Eisenhower, and Eisenhower had said vaguely that he would go to Korea. What did he mean by that? Nobody knew. But he is somewhat determined to end the conflict because it's unpopular, and he doesn't want it to drag on into his administration. And you also have, changes in Soviet policy because of the death of Stalin, and that also creates some new opportunity. And so you get, so you also have some changes in political leadership that accelerate the, accelerate the process in the end. And so, so I think, but I mean, basically, a lot of what you hear about, the North Koreans are tough negotiators, the Chinese are tough negotiators. I mean, that is true in a lot of ways, from what we know, at least to how the United States perceived it, because they would be, quite dogmatic on a lot of points. So, so I think this is sort of why they were, why the negotiations were so protracted.
And I will add too, just because I'm a specialist in Sigmund Rhee, that the negotiations were delayed at least 60 days after all the other parties had pretty much come to an agreement, simply because Sigmund Rhee refused to accept them. And as we talked about with Zach Medashevsky, he actually unilaterally started releasing POWs in the hopes that it would embarrass the Chinese and the North Koreans so badly that they would walk away from the negotiations. And I feel like you have to understand that for Sigmund Rhee, seeing that so much blood had already been shed in this war, he felt that it would be an absolute waste if the war stopped short of Korea being reunified. And he was constantly threatening to pull the ROK forces, which were the majority of the forces fighting against the communists. There's the Americans and the UN command, but the majority of the forces are actually Korean soldiers. And the way that the war was fought is they fought as a part of a United Nations command. There was one commander for all the forces. Rhee was constantly threatening to pull his forces out and to continue the war unilaterally on his own. And the only way that the Americans were, now you could argue maybe he was bluffing, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, but ultimately the only way the Americans could get him to acquiesce and at least abide by the armistice agreement was by telling him, we will sign a mutual security pact, essentially an alliance with the ROK. As long as you do not attack the North Koreans, we are committed to defending you in the future. And that's ultimately how they got Sigmund Rhee and the ROK military leadership, at least, to go along with the armistice. But it's worth pointing out, as many of you probably know, the ROK refuses to sign the armistice agreement. And the UN manages to get around that by having Mark Clark sign for all of the United Nations. But Sigmund Rhee refused to sign it. And for even a long time after the negotiations are signed or the armistice is enforced, he occasionally would still bluster about the possibility of marching north, as he used to like to say.
Right, and I there's one other point I'd had in my mind when I was talking about this, but it sort of slipped my mind, and now I remember it. But one of the issues with Sigmund Rhee as well was when it came to the anti-communist POWs, there were a number of POWs who had vowed their loyalty to Sigmund Rhee's government and who had by 1953 become avowedly anti-communist. So what do you do with these? Do you repatriate them to North Korea? Do you allow them to stay in South Korea? Sigmund Rhee was getting worried about the negotiations. So what he does is he just releases the anti-communist POWs. And this really frustrated the United States because they thought they were trying to negotiate this issue and they were going to work it out. And Sigmund Rhee does this without American permission. So this is an interesting aspect of the US alliance. Rhee didn't want to be completely subservient. He was dependent, but he tried to avoid being completely subservient, and he used a lot of tactics like that completely frustrated the United States, that prolonged the war, but served his objectives, which was to strengthening his rule and strengthening anti-communism in South Korea.
And I guess, Mickey, to answer the last part of your question, the mutual security arrangement between the ROK and the U.S. as a part of these negotiations, I think gets at the military readiness exercises that we see today that are ongoing. I know they've backed down. They've been decreased somewhat in number and funding under the Trump administration, but they still happen. And this is kind of a physical emblem of this alliance that's been going on for the last 70 years. And what the US and the ROK are doing by these exercises is they're maintaining readiness at any point, if necessary, to defend the ROK from further North Korean aggression. And so this is very much tied into the way the Korean War was, the way the armistice was negotiated, and the fact that you probably hear all the time, the Korean War has never ended. It's never technically ended. There's never been a peace treaty. There's just been an agreement under what terms they would stop shooting. Now, they've basically stopped shooting with a few exceptions for 70 years. So I think at some point you can say the Korean War has ended in a de facto sense. But as far as it being ended with the underlying issues resolved, that is still yet to happen. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you very much, and thank you for a very good answer on that, Greg. Yeah, do we have another question from the audience? All right, Greg, I want to jump down on the list just a little bit because I know you've spent significant time in Korea. I know you speak Korean. I know you read Korean very well. Your work has been translated into Korean. And I wonder how you would describe the differing perspectives on the Korean War. If we can generalize for a minute, and let's just say there is an American perspective and there is a Korean perspective, or maybe two Korean perspectives. How would you describe that to the teachers?
Well, I think first of all, when you hear about the war in the United States, one of the things that's often said is it's the forgotten war. And if you look at history textbooks, or even if you look at popular historical consciousness, and you look at the number of books about World War II, and you look at the number of books about the Vietnam War, and then you look at the number of books about the Korean War, I could guarantee you that the number of books about the Korean War is by far the least. Why is that? I think because in the American consciousness, it's not really the kind of dramatic victory over an evil adversary that World War II was, and it's also not the kind of traumatizing loss that Vietnam was. And so historians haven't spilled as much ink on it, even though I think if you look at the Korean Peninsula today, I think Korea issues are as, if not more important than Vietnam issues in a lot of ways. But I think that's one aspect of it. I also think there's something that the United States and China have in common to some degree, which is that they tend heavily to emphasize, one, the international dimensions of the war, and two, their own role as a sort of saviors of their respective Korean allies. And the Korean perspective, where it differs, I think, first of all, is that the war is, whether it's North Korea or South Korea, what I think unites them in their view of the war is that it's looked at as a tragedy, a terrible tragedy. It's looked at as a war that didn't really resolve, the main conflicts in Korea because it ends in stalemate. And so I think this view of the war as tragedy is important, and also their idea is that gratitude, at least on the South Korean side, I think gratitude towards the United States, it's part of how they see it, but it's not all of how they see it. And I think the same thing is true in terms of how North Korea views China. There's gratitude, but there's also the idea that the whole war was caused by the actions of the great powers, and that Korea was a victim. And if you look at the historical record, the reason that Korea was divided in the first place is not very good. It occurs at the end of World War II, and the United States had actually initially not really planned on occupying Southern Korea because before August of 1945, the United States had thought it was going to need Soviet help to defeat Japan. But then by the summer of 1945, all of a sudden, the United States has the atomic bomb. It's firebombing Japanese cities. It becomes pretty clear that the United States is going to be able to force Japan to surrender and surrender unconditionally. Then all of a sudden, the United States doesn't want Russian help on Japan because it wants to occupy it and be the sole occupying power without Russian involvement. And so then they start looking at Korea, and there's this traditional idea that Korea is a dagger pointed into the heart of Japan. And so Americans just come up with this plan to divide the Korean Peninsula. And they don't think Stalin will go for it initially, but to their surprise, he does. And there was no logic to why they would choose the 38th parallel. The only logic was that it put Seoul in the US zone. But there's really no historical significance to the 38th parallel in Korean history, right? So it was very much a rather arbitrary decision. And I think because of that, there's always the perception that, well, the US came and rescued Korea, but the fact that the peninsula was divided in the first place was also the fault of the great powers. And so their view of the US role is much more ambiguous than the way the United States typically represents its role. When I was in high school, I was taught, what was the significance? It was an undeclared war, whatever that meant. But the overarching narrative of American rescue was never really contradicted. And I didn't realize that until I got to college and started reading works that incorporated the Korean view of the war more.
I think that's a great answer, Greg, about how fundamentally different the Koreans see the war and the Americans see the war. And if I can just maybe push it a little further, I know when I like to give lectures on U.S.-Korean relations, I like to say that for too many Americans, U.S.-Korean relations start in June of 1950, when the American forces rush to Korea. The cavalry runs in. We save the Koreans from communism. And if you start those relations in 1950, you can see an intellectual trail of how you would get to Donald Trump's position that all the benefits of this relationship have flown in one direction. We have guaranteed Korea's security, and what do we get in return? But as you just described, there's not a single Korean who sees it that way. And for the Koreans, it's not just starting in 1950, not even just 1945. I've written a book going all the way back to 1882 and the Korean-American Treaty, which we don't need to get into here. I will happily share my book with you if you want to get the story going all the way back to 1882. But certainly, at least by 1945, that's a much better place to really start periodizing U.S.-Korean relations. And it is seen as, not just seen, it is quite an arbitrary decision. And another reason that the war is such a tragedy, we were just talking about the U.S.-Korea Mutual Defense Treaty, which is signed in 1953. In fact, Rhee is asking for such a treaty as early as 1948. When the Republic of Korea first becomes a nation, there's many people in South Korea who see the North as a real threat in the future, and they're urging the Americans to make a commitment to their security. And they believe if the United States does so, it's very unlikely that there will be a North Korean invasion. The United States refuses, there's a North Korean invasion, and in the end, the Americans end up making that commitment anyway as a way to make sure that the armistice happens. So when Rhee signs the armistice, it's not seen as, wow, what a concession we've gotten from the Americans. It's seen as, finally, we have gotten the Americans to at least take responsibility for the mess that they themselves created, that we have borne the brunt of the cost for. All right, we are at 3:30. Is there one final question from anyone in the audience? Wow, Mickey says her mind is blown. Wow, that's the best compliment. If that's directed at maybe me and Greg, that's the best compliment I've gotten all year. So probably more to Greg than to me. All right. Well, if there are no further questions, I just want to say thank you so much, Greg, for taking the time to speak with us today. This is our final session with a scholar. I am going to be offering next week one more office hours session like I did the first week of this program. And I'll let you know what that's going to be. If anyone wants to come, have any of their questions addressed, have any questions about anything else to do with this program, I'll be happy and be available for that. If any of you have any questions that you did not get answered, that you would really like to get answered, please email them to me and I can direct them to Greg or Charles or Zach or anyone else. I know people who can answer your questions if I cannot do it myself. So please don't end the program with any questions you have unanswered. And yeah, Greg, thank you very much. This has been a wonderful discussion.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and for those of you who were unable to make it or weren't able to make the whole session, I will have I will have this posted probably within 24 hours time, and hopefully everyone will be able to watch it that way. All right. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Did are you familiar with Nothing to Envy? The
Yes.
book about North Korea, and do you have what do you think about that? I'm sorry, this is kind of a later thing and people can leave, whatever. What do you think about that, and do you have any other books that are similar to that we can use? I know I took a passage of that and I actually blanked out the words Korea in it so that kids could read it without a country and to have them guess what the mystery nation was based on and the time period, because the excerpt that I used really made people think of, like the 1800s, and how people had to negotiate life without a lot of amenities and things like that. And I'm wondering if you have anything like that might work for some like contemporary American society, classes and things like that.
Books about North Korea, you mean, that are similar to that?
That, or yeah, just in general that are going to deal with more of those contemporary relations with the historical event. Do you have any other suggestions?
Right. Well, I think one issue with some of these books is that they're done through through oral histories with North Korean defectors. So I mean, for historians, it's like I think Nothing to Envy is a good read. I think the author, I'm not sure about the author's Korean language skills, but there's certainly interesting material there. Another book that's somewhat similar, I think, is Bradley Martin, I think the name is, Under the Loving Care of the Fatherly Leader.
Yep.
And just as a work that sort of explains North Korea's trajectory, I actually think it's better than Nothing to Envy. And he also has tons of oral history interviews that he did. But I think his expertise may be a little bit deeper. Another book that's similar is Suki Kim, Without You, There Is No Us. Her book has been somewhat controversial, but I'll give her credit that she had guts, because if you look at how she got her data, she actually taught at this this school in North Korea, which I think was had sort of linkages to missionary organizations, and allowed like a limited number of outside instructors. And right, as David says, the Pyongyang Institute, it's a sort of she sort of talks about her life there and how North Koreans were taught. I think that's also I think where I give her I think she penetrated North Korean society a little bit more deeply than Demick did. So I also give her credit. Some people have criticized her work, but I think the work also has a lot of interesting information, and what she did was definitely she took a tremendous personal risk to herself and her own well-being to do this. So I think she deserves kudos for that.
Yeah, thanks. I have to mention that I actually make a small cameo in Suki Kim's book
Oh, you
because
do.
my wife was at the Pyongyang Institute of Science and Technology the same time Suki Kim was. And
Woo!
You
and
know it
actually,
better than I do, maybe. Yeah.
yeah, I actually got to know Suki Kim a little bit, and she's an interesting character. I'm not mentioned by name in the book, but
All
I'm
right.
mentioned as the husband of a fellow teacher.
Okay.
That fellow teacher was actually my wife.
I didn't pick up on that, but I'll have to go back and look at it. So.
Yeah, and my wife had she has an interesting perspective on Suki Kim, having spent time at the same institution, and they came away with different impressions of the North Koreans themselves and also of what they were doing. But I think this is why you read a number of books. And so I think Gregg's suggestion of Suki Kim together with Barbara Demick is a great, it's always great to at least read two different takes on one topic. And Gregg, I think your reservations about a lot of defector literature is absolutely spot on. I think reading defector literature is important. I think it's an insight into North Korean society for sure. But there's also the issue that very little of it can be verified. And there have been many cases, probably the most famous one, Escape from Camp 14, Blaine Harden's book. And Blaine is also someone who I know well and really respect, but parts of that book had to be retracted after it came out that it was not all accurate. And that leads to its own discussion of, do we expect people who have gone through such trauma to necessarily tell their stories to the level of accuracy that we would expect of a professional historian, or a journalist? But there's a fascinating set of issues around defector literature. And I think Demick is a strong book. I think Suki Kim is a strong book. And I think it's good to read multiple books. And yeah, I like what you do, Mickey, with Barbara Demick's Nothing to Envy in the World. I think that's a very clever assignment for your students.
Thank you. Well, thank you both for your time and the extended time on that. And I look forward to the book list and that kind of stuff. So thank you so much.